The reason I class this as the most concerning, the most serious, is there's no known solution. Anything else, we could have a conversation about solutions. There's no known solution to this. In fact, there's evidence that this is exactly how civilizations end.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Stephen J. Shaw talks about plummeting birth rates.
So for all these societies, we're now in a situation really where we're going to be looking at shrinking communities, we're going to be looking at effectively collapse.
We discuss what population collapse will do to our society.
The NHS, under this scenario, will be completely unsustainable. Why? Because the number of workers will be shrinking compared to the larger number of older people to support.
And we talk about how we ever got to this point.
Antinatalists have had it their own way for decades now, just preaching about this, frankly, nonsense, or nonsense in terms of how low birth rates can improve the environment, but also have been really cruel to women who want to be mothers, which is, frankly, most women.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with documentary maker and data analyst Stephen J. Shaw. Stephen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invite.
So you made a documentary about population collapse. To put into some context, in England and Wales, the birth rate figures for 2022 were the lowest ever recorded. It was 1.49 children per woman. And what does that mean, and why is it important?
Yeah, we quote these numbers of, what we call the fertility rate, the number of children the average woman would have in her lifetime based on current birth patterns. But it's not a very useful number because what does 1.49 mean? I like to translate that into what I call a societal half-life. The time taken in years for births to half, and then half again, and then half again. A fertility rate of 1.49 will produce a half-life of around 50 years. So 50 years from now, there'll be half the number of babies born in England and Wales, and probably Scotland, Northern Ireland too, I imagine. They can't be that different. And that will keep going on forever, literally forever, until birth rates go back up to what we call replacement level of 2.1. So we're a long way from getting back up to that level.
So that was England and Wales, but is this a thing that's happening in a lot of countries?
It's almost global now. Really where I live in Japan, and the number has been down around 1.3, 1.4 for 40 or 50 years. UK actually is not quite as bad as many countries in continental Europe who have been in this situation for a very long time. Italy and even Germany, certainly Spain, Austria, Switzerland have experienced even lower rates for a longer period of time. I should mention Africa because people think of Africa in terms of high birth rates. But even in sub-Saharan Africa, since 1980, the average woman has been having one fewer child every 15 years. And they're going to get down to replacement level by around 2050 or so. So it really is a global phenomenon.
So was there a point when this started? It seems not long ago we were being told about population explosion.
Right, and that all happened at a time, there's a famous book called The Population Bomb, published in the late 60s by a butterfly expert of all people, Paul Ehrlich. And he still is around spouting the same story about population explosions. He's 90 years old now. So it's very clear that that was an ideology. It's an ideology if you don't update your data sets and keep saying the same thing, even when circumstances change. But if you go back to the late 60s, you could already see in the data that the growth that was unfolding at that time, and there was a lot of population growth going on at that time, but you could see it was starting to straighten. Modeling predictions, I think, even around that time were showing that this is going to slow around now. We get about a 50-year warning of what's going to happen in terms of population trends generally, because it takes time for people to grow up and live their lives. So it's not a new phenomenon at all. It's just taken several decades for most people to notice.
So, these are different countries with different cultures, but they're all experiencing the same thing. Is there a reason that you can pin that matches them all?
Yes, so this was my conundrum. Professionally, I'm a data scientist. Data analytics is what I've been doing through my company for 20 years or more. And the idea that this could be independent, parallel trends really just didn't make any statistical sense. You don't get the same trends happening in so many countries at the exact same time, going back to the early 70s when this started in the UK, in the US, Japan, Italy, etc. You don't have trends like that happening for such an extended period of time without there being some common thread, or the statistical likelihood of that is nigh impossible. Yet there has been what I call a crisis in demography, because demographers have not been able to find a common connection. Instead, they have typically blamed local issues. So in Japan, it's work-life balance. In other countries, it's childcare policies. In Italy, it's youth unemployment. But actually, that didn't make any sense to me until I went to kind of find out what might actually connect all of these things. And the reason, quite simply, is demographers have been looking at the average woman. Back to TFR, the average woman would have 1.49 children in their lifetime in England and Wales. You have to go beyond that. I think we've known culturally for some decades that there's no such thing as an average woman. And yet, from a demographic point of view and an analysis point of view, we've stuck with this idea. What we find is, if we look at average family size across all of those nations since around 1970, there has been no change. What has changed is a rocketing amount of childlessness, most of which I believe is unplanned. It's delayed parenthood, leading to a large number of people in these countries becoming childless for life. So it's very clear. You look at Japan. The average woman in 1970 was having around 2.3 children. It's the same today.
I found that quite surprising when I watched your documentary, that the average family size was the same.
Yeah, and even it goes, if you look at larger families, again, 1970, 6% of Japanese 6% of Japanese mothers were having 4 more children. Today, it's exactly the same. So it seems to be that motherhood is incredibly robust once someone becomes a mother. And I say that because if you look at what's happened over the past 50 years across all of these countries, there's been a substantive change, improvement in women's education, into women's opportunities in the workforce, closing of gender gaps, changes of economic situations, etc. All those things have happened, yet the average mother is having the same number of children as 50 years ago. It's the same in the UK. UK is around 2.3 as well. US, actually, the number of children mothers are having in the US has gone up slightly from 2.4 to 2.6 now over that time frame. So motherhood is resilient, incredibly resilient. What is not resilient, what is much more volatile, is the risk of childlessness.
So what kind of proportion of women are having children versus wanting to have children but not doing so?
Yeah, and you've got to be a little bit careful how you measure this. Demographers typically wait until a woman's 45 or 49 and then determine whether she had a child or not. And the issue I have with that is you've got to wait several decades to find out the actual final prevalence of childlessness in basically 50-year-olds. But what we're able to do, in the same way we assess TFR, total fertility rate, by just looking across the country and saying, okay, what are 20-year-olds doing right now in terms of number of children, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds? We can do the same thing and look at the incidence of motherhood. And that gives you kind of an early indicator of where things are heading. So in the UK, basically, we're looking at 30% of women now on a path towards being childless for life. In South Korea, which is now the country with the most worrying, lowest of the low birth rates at 0.7 children per woman, remarkable. Childlessness now is trending at 55%. A woman born today, a teenage girl today in South Korea, if she has the same kind of opportunity to have children, to call it that, there's probably better terms, she'll have less than a 50-50 chance of ever becoming a mother.
So, you're talking about your half-life thing. How would that work in South Korea with those figures?
It's shocking. So a child born this year in South Korea, birth rates stay the same. within 20 years, there will be half the number of births, meaning half the number of kindergartens after 20 years. Another 20 years forward, that's down to a quarter. By the time someone born in Korea today reaches old age, we're looking at about 10% of the number of kindergartens in elementary schools. Of course, then that ripples through the entire rest of the system. It's unsustainable.
Yeah, it's incredible. What kind of effects do you expect to see on society or something like that?
Yeah, and if I could just explain in the case of South Korea, if they were to magically tomorrow return to a birth rate of 2.1, of course that won't happen, but if they did, they would still see massive population decrease for many decades because this is now baked in. What I mean is that in recent years, in recent decades, because of the historic falling birth rates, there's now so few young people to be able to become parents. So for all these societies, we're now in a situation really where we're going to be looking at shrinking communities. We're going to be looking at effectively collapse. We're looking at vacant houses. We're looking at businesses that can't find customers, businesses that can't find staff. So even if you were to say, well, that's all okay because there's too many people, the population decline, or it is collapse. It's not something that we're kind of gliding down through where we kind of reach some equilibrium and everything will be fine. No nation in history has been known to ever come out of this level of low birth rates. So it's just shocking. Now you asked about the impact. I mean, let's just talk about a couple of other things. We all like our health systems in the UK. The UK is very proud of the NHS. The NHS, under this scenario, will be completely unsustainable. Why? Because the number of workers will be shrinking compared to the larger number of older people to support. And then people might say, well, the older people, it's their fault. I hear this quite a lot, the boomer generation, they had it good. No, this affects everybody. When you go to your local doctor or healthcare, provider, whatever that is, the ratio of older people there to be taken care of will increase and increase and increase. So, and then the pension system, the unfunded pension systems we have around the world where people are paying into a pension, maybe thinking that that's for their future, but it's not. That pension money is used to support today's older generation because that older generation, when they paid in, supported the previous older generation. So pensions being paid today are to support current retirees. And as you kind of shrink population-wise, there's just going to be less and less in the pot to be able to share it amongst these relatively large number of older people. So there's nothing good about population collapse. Maybe the end game, some people might think, is good to have fewer people on the planet. Maybe some people believe that. But the kind of the multi-decade path to get there, it's going to dominate this century.
Do you think as a society we will have to change our attitude towards older people, how we treat them, etc., when the society keeps aging like that?
Well, I worry about this because I think we're seeing already greater intergenerational conflict. I think there will be more bitterness between those younger people who still can't get on the property ladder in some nations, having to pay more and more taxes to support retirees. That's not good for any society. So I think being aware of the likelihood of intergenerational conflict is a good thing because I think we can anticipate it and we can hopefully have some policies to help ameliorate that situation. But intergenerational conflict is going to become, I think, unfortunately, something we're going to see more and more of.
Your documentary is called Birth Gap. What is a birth gap? It's
the gap between the larger number of older people in society and the shrinking number of workers, effectively. It's that gap. So when you talk about population, sometimes people will respond, well, there's too many people anyway. The reason I call it birth gap, it's not about the actual number. It's the shape of societies, this gap between those people who need support and those people who are working to effectively provide that support.
Have you found from your research you've been doing that the state of the economy has quite a big influence on whether people have children or not?
It's fascinating because, once again, it has no real impact on mothers. Once you have your first child, whatever the state of the economy, you're going to probably go on and have a second child after the first and maybe a third. But in terms of childlessness, what we see is a series of what I call baby shocks that occurred in prior decades. So for the UK, the baby shock was around 1973, right. Same time as Japan and Italy, where childlessness here went from almost negligible levels, less than 5%. Same in Japan, same in Italy. Within 3 to 4 years, up to over 20%, and then now heading towards 30%, case of Japan up to 35%. So we can map back to a time in 73 when there was an economic oil shock to say, actually, and it's very clear because we had the oil shock in 73 and the birth rates went down towards the end of 74. So there's actually a 9-month delay in the impact. And if you look at Japan, we can see that impact across every region of Japan. It's not just the cities, it's not rural areas being different, it's universal. Well, what about the US? Well, the US had 2 baby shocks. First was 71, which is an interesting year around the time of what's known as the Nixon shock, the changing of the gold standard for currencies around the world. But at that point, childlessness only increased to around 15-17%, much lower than the UK and other European nations at that time. But then you have the mortgage Lehman shock, 07-08, and suddenly the US gets a second baby shock. And we're still seeing that play out today where, since that time, the US has now gone up. The US is actually projecting at 38% childlessness. And that all maps back to a change in societal trends going back to the Lehman shock. So in every case where you see these shocks in childlessness, you can link it to some major turmoil going on within the nation. And what's interesting, if I can just add, is after the turmoil's over, after the oil shock's over, birth rates never go back down. It's a one-time shock directionally. Childlessness never reverts to its prior level. So it really is seeing these shocks were really a trigger for societies moving towards higher childlessness. And why is that? Well, if you look at the data at an even more granular level, you find that people started delaying parenthood at the time of these shocks. Right. If you already had your first child, no change, but young people without children were deferring having a child from early 20s to late 20s to early 30s. That has now become societal norm, early 30s. And that's where things can go wrong for people.
Are there any countries that are bucking the trend?
Short answer is no, but there are a couple of interesting countries. Hungary being one, where they still have a low birth rate similar to the UK, but they had been at a much lower rate 10, 12 years ago. They had been down to 1.2 children per woman, and they have managed to increase it to 1.5. Still a low level, but that gives potential hope both to Hungary and other nations looking at what they did. What we see there is a large increase in marriage rates of younger people, a small increase in family size, but only a small one, a very major reduction in that childlessness number, and I haven't seen that anywhere else. It's too early to be sure, but Hungary looks to be interesting. The other country that's brought up in this context is Israel, which has got a birth rate of 3.1 children per woman overall. But when you look at that, it's clearly a very segregated nation. So what we see there is that 15% of Israeli mothers are having an average of 6 children each. Meanwhile, in a more secular sense, we have around 20% societal childlessness in Israel. So you've got different communities, I think, blended together. So the overall average of 3 children per woman is a little bit of overly simplistic in terms of what's happening there.
So is that religious values that's skewing that?
Well, certainly we can link religiosity to larger family sizes, and that's universal. So the more religious a family is, the more likely they will have more children, whether that's in Israel or whether it's Mormons or Amish, I guess, etc. So that is a component in all of this, yes.
It seems from my kind of layman's perspective, what you're saying is if someone has a child, that kind of unlocks things. That's the magic step, and things go back to normal. But it's getting that step from having no children to having one that is the big sticking point.
So why is that? And this is open to some level of interpretation, but the data actually tells us already quite a lot. First of all, from large-scale surveys, including one in the UK that was done at the end of last year on 1,500 UK women between the age of 18-35, we saw that 92% of women in that group either had a child or wanted to have a child. So those intending purposely not to have a family represent only about 8% of women in the UK. So, and we should support those people. I always like to make clear when I talk that, I wouldn't want to live in a society that made people who don't want children feel guilty about it or force them to have children in any way. I think that would be terrible. But it is really quite a small number. We see the same in the US from CDC surveys, large scale, 6,000 person interviews. So I'm convinced that most people do set out on a course of expecting, wanting, hoping to become a parent one day. So what happens along the way? Is it biology? The evidence for it being a biological factor is actually quite weak until you get to situations like South Korea or even Spain, where we see very late family forming happening, late 30s, 22% of Korean women are starting a family in their late 30s and consequently only being able to have one child more often than other age groups. So biology only explains part of this. The biggest reason is not having a partner who's on the same page at the right time. So you get to 32, you might not have a partner. You might have gone through a breakup or divorce, or your partner just might not quite be at that moment where he or she is ready at that moment. And by definition, it's harder to, you have a shortened window in which to start a family in your 30s compared to your 20s. So it's delayed parenthood that summarizes this trend, and that's universal.
Do you think people understand that it's difficult to have children as you get older, and that to some degree they're led to believe that you can have children until quite a later age than is normal?
No, there's huge misinformation on this. And I think that's one of the things we really need to be doing more than anything is educating younger people on what the fertility window really is. And this affects men and women because whilst men technically can have a child late into life, you still need to partner with someone who is able to have a child, and that typically, falls quite sharply after age 30. So from my data, we can see very clearly that a woman at most has a 50-50% chance of becoming a mother if she's childless at 30. Toss of a coin, 50-50 at 30. When I asked people in a survey in the US actually what age they thought that was going to happen, I think 50% of people said 40 and 35% of people said 35. There's a huge misunderstanding of the mechanics, the realities of what has to happen, and this assumption in societies that, well, anyone can find a partner if they want a child, when actually that is the biggest reason people are remaining childless for life. So why is it then that we do such a great job in our high schools, colleges, of teaching young people how to avoid pregnancy, when in those same lessons we could also be extending that to say, by the way, here is a possible window for you, and here's data like what I just shared with you. That's not happening anywhere. And it's not happening in UN programs around the world. I mean, all we're doing is telling people how to avoid parenthood or delay parenthood. And that's part of the problem here.
Why is there such an anti-parenthood slant on things?
Well, I think it goes back to the forces that were around in the late 60s, 70s. And even prior to that, back to the time of Malthus, who was a British both preacher but also a demographer, in a sense, one of the earlier demographers who came up with this sense that we're going to run out of resources. The Malthus view is still quoted today, that the Earth has got certain resources and would only ever be able to cope with maybe 1 billion people. Well, that wasn't true. 3 billion people, that wasn't true. We've got 8 billion people on the planet today, and we're wealthier and better fed than we've ever been before. In fact, there's more people suffering from obesity today than starvation. But that viewpoint is still ingrained in people's minds. And what I've come to, what I've become directly exposed to are those elements of society who really don't like the message that, perhaps people should be having children younger. And these are people who are antinatalist in some contexts, and that spans a range of people, from those people who believe that it doesn't really matter for a woman if she has children or not. The most important thing is career. And there's certain voices that have focused purely on women's careers without any consideration of whether they want to become parents or not. And the gender gap index is a classic example of that. We measure the gender gap based on purely economic and societal, things unrelated to motherhood. But it's also from the environmental movement, who overly simplistically would say there's too many people on the planet and the planet is stressed. Well, it takes 40 or 50 years for any major change in birth rates to have any impact on the environment, because people have to live out their lives. So a sudden drop in birth rates tomorrow again would take decades to have an impact, and we're already on our way down. We're already actually tail spinning down anyway. So the argument that today we need to further reduce birth rates to help the environment is really at best outdated. But there's these voices out there. I think antinatalists have had it their own way for decades now, just preaching about this frankly nonsense, or nonsense in terms of how low birth rates can improve the environment, but also have been really cruel to women who want to be mothers, which is frankly most women.
So in your documentary, you are in various places throughout the world interviewing people about why they didn't have children. Some of it's quite touching. And what kind of reasons did they tell you?
Yeah. So in the documentary, I visited 24 countries, effectively every continent, not Australia, but everywhere else. And during the making of the documentary, I was doing my own research, and that's when I, partway through the documentary, I discovered this rapid increase in childlessness. And you see me going to Latin American countries asking this question quite a lot, and literally before we were planning to film there, that's when I made this discovery. And what we see there is a series of Latin American women, and laterally US women and around the world, who aged 40s, 50s, just told their stories where they had assumed that they had time. One classically said, I miscalculated. She thought that she could wait until she's 40 before having to seriously think about family, and then couldn't. We interviewed another mother-to-be actually, from Argentina, and she was late 40s, but pregnant. But it wasn't her own egg.
Right.
She wasn't able to kind of give birth to her own natural child, you might say, genetic child. And then the emotions that came out from these people, the tears, and I realized that, these people were telling me about their loss, their grief, as it's often called, about remaining childless for life. They were telling me, possibly I was the first person they'd ever spoken to about this. And that's what happens in society. People who had planned to be parents, I know there'll be some listening here, and my heart goes out to anyone in that situation. But these are people who typically suffer quietly in their homes. They don't typically write about it. They certainly don't protest in the streets in the same way that antinatalists would. So in terms of what I was hearing consistently, and then from the fertility doctors, I interviewed 4 fertility doctors as well, I realized, oh my gosh, this is not just a small desire that we could equate to anything else in life. That for these people, and I believe it represents a vast majority of childless people around the world, these are people who had, I'm going to say desperately wanted to become a parent, and are living with the consequences of that. I will add something because it's only right to do so, because there are communities and support groups out there. Gateway Women would be one I'd highly recommend, but there's others for men too. And they tell me that there is a moment in time, perhaps after menopause, where there is acceptance. Not for everyone, I know not for everyone, but for many. But there is a period of time of grieving for the loss of something that women and men who are childless never had.
So this is a worldwide existential problem. And do you think it's getting the attention it deserves? Are governments and world leaders doing anything about it?
Absolutely not. I mean, it's incredible. I rank this as the most serious crisis humanity is facing. And humanity is facing quite a number of crises. But the reason I class this as the most concerning, the most serious, is there's no known solution. Anything else, we could have a conversation about solutions. There's no known solution to this. In fact, there's evidence that this is exactly how civilizations end. So if you go back to the Romans, you find that policies were put in place to try and increase the birth rate. And what they tried was to put taxes on those without children and those with only one child, and punishments over not being able to get a pension if you didn't have a child. So that's recorded, and yet we know the Roman Empire faded away. And I'm not an expert on Roman history, but there are Roman experts who put demography as one of the reasons that the Roman Empire, well, it didn't fall overnight, it basically faded away. And that's exactly what's happening to us now. We're fading away. This is what it feels like to fade away.
You mentioned Hungary made some improvements to their fertility rate. And what did they do? Is there something we can learn from?
I think we can learn from it, and I'm spending a fair amount of time there. I'm actually heading there on Sunday. I'm going to meet some families in Hungary in remote towns to find out, what the policies over the past 10 years meant to them, which is going to be interesting. There are two policies that are talked about, and they're very interesting. They may have had an effect, but I think there's another thing, which is just within Hungary. You arrive at the airport and you walk up the jet bridge, and there's these signs saying family-friendly Hungary. You go to the opera house and there's a sign saying family-friendly Hungary. You have this feeling that Hungarians care about family. Not in a coercive way at all, but just in a general way that family's a good, healthy thing. The two policies that are talked about, and they are interesting, is one that a woman who has 4 children will never pay income tax for life. And there has been an increase, a small increase in 4-child families in Hungary. Not dramatic yet, but may take time to get to 4 children. The one I perhaps like the most, because I think we could all try it and see what happens, is for there to be a loan scheme for younger people who want to start a family. And the system they have, I believe, is quite unique in that you can nominate your ideal family size, 1, 2, 3, or 4 children. And the size of loan you'll get increases based on the number of children you'll have, because you'll need a bigger home. And then if you end up having that number of children, some or all of the loan is forgiven. And I think that might have been the reason that we're seeing an increase in marriage rates in Hungary, and why we're seeing a reduction in societal childlessness level. So back in 2010, a teenage girl in Hungary, based on societal patterns, would have had a 42% likelihood of remaining childless for life. That fell very quickly down to 28%. So, and we haven't seen that anywhere else. So I don't know if it's just the family-friendly nature of Hungary and the breadth of policies that they have, or whether they've found kind of the golden kind of policy that might apply everywhere. Back to your point, are we doing enough? Are we hearing enough about this? No. I mean, every country should be talking about this in their parliaments, looking at Hungary and saying, do you know what, we'll try that. Now, let's not wait another 10 years to find out how Hungary progresses, because you lose another 10 years of birth rates going down and down and down, fewer parents. I mean, it's I'm doing my best through the documentary and what I plan to do in future just to increase the urgency It's frightening because it's a problem that gets worse day by day, year by year, but you don't feel it. You don't walk down the street, you don't read it in the news, and that's one of the most unfortunate things, that it just creeps up over decades.
What kind of reactions have you had to the documentary?
There's been quite a wide spectrum of reactions. The most positive reaction are the messages I get almost every week now from someone who says, I'm pregnant, here's a picture of my baby, I watched your documentary, I sat down with my boyfriend, husband, partner, and here we are. And that's really, really heartwarming. Also heartwarming is when I've shown the documentary to high schools in Japan, colleges in the US and here, the engagement level in this conversation that young people, well, first of all, there's shock from young people. We're not telling them about this. They're hearing counter messages, if you like, about the environment, etc. No one has ever, most likely, never told them there's a chance that you will remain childless for life if you don't start to think about the timing of when that might happen. But more than that, I get encouragement from young people simply wanting to talk about this topic between each other. I'll leave the room and I can see conversations are forming and continuing quite intensely. On the other side of it, there are the attacks. I get online, and perhaps most famously when I tried to screen the documentary at Cambridge University last May. I was invited there by Charlie Bentley Astor, who I think was on your show, and I got a phone call, I think it was 2 days before the screening was due to happen. Literally, I was boarding my flight from Tokyo to come to the screening, and Charlie had never called me before. It was always messages. I thought, okay, this is interesting. And the university have cancelled the screening because of potential for protests, riots from young people who thought that documentaries shouldn't be made about this topic, which is crazy.
Can you understand why? Because watching the documentary is quite touching and it feels really important. Why would someone be against it? Yeah,
and I think a core point here is they hadn't watched the documentary. There's only a part of it had been released, so this is obviously was nothing to do with the documentary itself. To stand back from it, a lot of ideologies are founded or incorporate the belief that children aren't that important. There's different waves of feminism that might have adopted that for one reason or another. Environmentalism might have as well. And we have then just the raw antinatalists who would be quite happy if we frankly went extinct. I think when you share, through the documentary in my case, when you share that actually the vast majority of people do want children and that those who don't end up grieving, I think it threatens those ideologies. Right. And, it's a sensitive topic, but, Charlie's story, having invited me, was a very touching one because she had been close to going through, to be transitioned to become a boy. And then she's written about how she realized that she was just a tomboy, that she didn't want to go through surgery. But when you see what's happening to young people, effectively sterilizing young people before they've had the opportunity to even discover whether they might want to become a parent, I think that lobby was also significantly behind the Cambridge protests.
Stephen J. Shaw, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.